You're listening to The Pipeline, the Western Standards National Affairs Program, recording this Wednesday, February 19th, 2020. Each week, we break down the issues, discuss them in depth, and examine some of the broader implications for Western Canada and beyond. Featuring from Calgary, the Western Standards publisher, Derek Fildebrandt. Welcome, Derek.
Hello, Paul.
And featuring from Strathmore, Deirdre Mitchell-McLean, our senior reporter.
Good afternoon.
And myself, digital editor Paul Holmes from Victoria, British Columbia. All right, guys, very interesting development this week. We have more blockades to talk about and a couple of developments around the blockades. We're going to also talk about the block motion on the Teck project. And we'll finish up with a little bit about the Edmonton Eskimos. So we'll start off with the blockades. What's the very latest news? I mean, there's 13 things going on around the country. Deirdre, what have you observed this week?
Well, this week obviously has been very big with the number of blockades. And it's Trudeau canceled his vacation, or not vacation, but what?
It was a vacation.
It was a vacation. He did cancel that after weeks of blockades. So he did decide to stick around and, maybe do something about it. But it's actually ramped up this week, really. And we had one start this morning in just west of Edmonton, and that one already has some counter protesters who have arrived. They showed up around noon, and United We Roll is heading out there as well for a peaceful counter protest, and they should be arriving by about 5:15.
And here in Victoria, the Premier's house was blockaded or I guess picketed interestingly, by people who claim to be part of Extinction Rebellion, if I understand that, which is new. I don't remember Extinction Rebellion taking any claim for this. And 3 were arrested. And I guess the Premier did confront them. He came home while they were there. So that's...
Well, good on Horgan for finally drawing a line on when the police should intervene in illegal blockades. I guess the line is when it shows up on his driveway.
I suppose.
These guys were... it was really... Their language was interesting. They were there to perform a citizen's arrest, or people's arrest, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
A people's arrest of the Premier for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, if that sounds a little overblown, it shouldn't be, because the Prime Minister endorsed the recommendations that came out of his own government, saying that there is an ongoing genocide in Canada. That was pretty wild language. There's obviously been terrible things done to First Nations in Canada's history. I don't think there's ever been a genocide of them in Canada. I think that's unfair. I think there's been terrible treatment. But genocide is a particularly loaded term. But it also said an ongoing genocide. So if there is an ongoing genocide, I think we should probably arrest the Führer for it.
Well, I do think that that historians would probably recognize the very early maritime contact as a form of genocide. But it's debatable, I suppose, how to classify.
Take it up with the Queen.
That's exactly right. So I picked up my phone yesterday and I subscribe to The Economist magazine, and as a result, I get their daily hit. What's the biggest news story in the world? And the biggest news story in the world yesterday was the ongoing blockades in Canada. So we're now, in case there was any question, this is now internationally famous news. We're affecting major parts of the economy. Obviously, you can't move things around if trains can't go. So lots of rhetoric has been raised, lots of anger from surprising places. Obviously, the Premier of British Columbia being one of the people that we would expect historically would be sympathetic Obviously,
he was until they showed up on his doorstep.
Well, there's that. And then we saw I guess the prospect of a motion to take down the government. And how did that play out? Derek, did you want to speak to that one first?
Well, word came, I think it started leaking yesterday, but it was confirmed today that Andrew Scheer was moving to put forward a motion of non-confidence against the government. Right before we started recording, it came out, I think unsurprisingly to those of us watching closely, that their non-confidence motion is now a non-confidence motion. They're not. It'll be tabled for future use at some date, which is not unusual in a minority parliament, since you want the ability to use it whenever you want. But they're not going to put it forward. Both the Bloc Québécois and the NDP, I'm not sure what the Greens said, but the third and fourth parties said they will not support it. To bring down the government, you would need the support of all three major opposition parties, so all the opposition parties, less the Greens. And they didn't have that support. But I also think that my suspicion is, and I got this sense speaking to some Conservative MPs in the last few days here, that this was one of two things and possibly combined. It was never actually meant to bring down the government. It was just to show the Conservatives thumping their chest a bit. But also a bit more, in a bit more of a Machiavellian sense, this was Andrew Scheer's last Hail Mary to stay the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. Because if you go into an election right now and he wins it, he gets to become prime minister. And it's pretty hard to remove someone who's already won. So he may have been praying that the motion succeeds, brings down the government. Even though the Tories are broke, they don't have money for an election. They're a pretty tough financial circumstances. They are, relative to the other parties, still have by far the best ability to pay off their debts and build a snap war chest to be able to fund a campaign. They might be broke, but the other parties are more broke. And so like in a war of attrition, you may have lost a lot of men, but if the other guys lost more, you're in better shape. So there was a lot of pushback in the Conservative caucus that were kind of seeing through this, that this, they'd be going into an election with an unpopular leader, not supported by the caucus, not supported by the party's rank and file, and with, not that there's very many people of profile campaigning for the leadership of the Conservative Party, but there is a race going on, at least technically, awaiting the final anointing of Peter MacKay. So caucus kiboshed that, both because it wouldn't pass, but also even if it did, most of the Conservative caucus do not want to go into another election with Andrew Scheer.
And I did notice on Twitter this week, Peter MacKay actually had some very strong words in a video about the blockade, which was frankly surprising, and got a lot of blowback from the usual detractors on Twitter that don't like anything conservatives say. But I thought it was very surprising to see him be that forthright and strongly positioned on this issue. Deirdre, what are your thoughts about the political side of this?
So, like I was kind of talking about earlier, I'm really confused as a political watcher, and have been, since before Scheer became leader. I don't understand how he hasn't been forced to resign already. Like, in what other situation has this happened where someone loses the election, steps down as leader, all of these things that have come out, the spending scandals, how is he still not even in the party, but in a position where he could force a non-confidence vote, just potentially and run as prime minister, or run for prime minister again?
Deirdre, you said you can't recall you can't imagine that's ever happened. It actually happened about a decade ago when Stéphane Dion lost an election terribly, lost half of his caucus, got completely smashed, announced his intention to resign as the Liberal leader, and then a month after announces he's about to become the prime minister of a coalition with the Bloc Québécois and NDP. So it has happened before where someone's attempted this. It just didn't end well.
And one would expect that it wouldn't end well again. But I'm really like, yeah, let's go all conspiracy theory here. But what on earth does Andrew Scheer have on the Conservative Party that they have not said, dude, you're done?
Well, he's kowtowed to the dairy lobby, so there's that. Sorry,
the dairy lobby
was that my
still
outside voice?
Sorry, Paul. Did you realize how good that pun was?
Oh yes, the kowtow. The best puns always are the ones you don't realize until the end. It's I'm as baffled as you are, Deirdre.
Okay.
I think the thing is, you have and I've watched politics most of my life. I think the thing is you can't allow something like this and the seemingly aloof prime minister, traveling around the world and just hoping that this problem fixes itself. You can't allow that to go unchecked, even if you are leader in name only, right? And so I think they had to do something, and so, did anybody?
But now they look
really
cowardly. They could have put forward a motion of censure. They could have,
right.
If the goal was to make clear that the prime minister's actions are flaccid and unacceptable, they could have put forward a motion of censure, which is like saying we don't have confidence, but not calling for an election, just saying we're angry at you. They could have done that, but instead they talked about a motion of non-confidence, which has much graver implications for forcing an election.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder if the NDP would have, and or the Bloc would have supported a motion even of censure, though.
I'm not sure they would have, because as much as Trudeau has been kowtowing to the radicals here, the NDP and the Bloc do so even more. So if it was a motion of censure, it would have had to say specifically what about, whereas a non-confidence motion like the one they proposed was just very straightforward. It was just, we have lost confidence in the government, therefore triggering an election. A motion of censure would have to say what they were being censured for. And so it probably would have been just the Conservatives voting with it.
Well, then that certainly, that's a really good point, and it certainly backs up your case on the Hail Mary for Andrew Scheer, because obviously not putting a descriptor on it opens the door for the NDP and the Bloc to get behind the motion and without specifically appearing to go after the protesters. But I can imagine that the news would have played it, that way. And I think the NDP, frankly, would
Peter
have been
MacKay's got a large
it.
contingent of the caucus supporting his leadership right now. And I would imagine that if Andrew Scheer had pressed forward with this, he probably would have had a very large contingent of MacKay's supporters, both the ones who are openly endorsed and the ones who are biding their time to endorse. They could have been very well willing to break ranks, and so it would have been a humiliation of his leadership. So he had no choice but to pull this, even if he wanted to go forward, even for the best of reasons.
Is there anything else to say about the Conservative leadership race other than the apparent fait accompli of Peter MacKay's leadership before we move on to the Bloc motion?
MacKay's already won. Move on. Story's over. MacKay's the new leader.
Yeah.
All right. So on that lovely note, the non-race race is on. Assuming that he can't just put his foot in it really bigly, which I suppose remains to be seen, but not sure who comes out on top if he does that. All right, Bloc motion on Teck. Deirdre, you want to set this one up for us?
So the Bloc Québécois they tabled a motion. It went largely unnoticed, at least by media sources. It was tabled, even a day or 2 days before we wrote about it? Does that seem about right, Derek?
Yeah, I think it was tabled. I think we picked it up on a Monday. It was tabled, I think, a day or two before we reported on it. Yeah,
and so the Bloc's motion, and that's the motion that we should have actually had. Let me see here. I'll look that up, actually, Derek, while you start going on.
Well, so
Why don't you
block
rant while we look up
the block
motion?
tabled a motion. The way things work federally, it actually confused me because it uses different language than is used at the provincial level in Alberta. But parties, unlike in Alberta, opposition parties are allowed to actually table opposition day motions. You don't get that in Alberta. Opposition parties don't get to put anything forward unless they win a draw for a private member's bill or motion. But every once in a while, depending on how many seats an opposition party has, they get something called an opposition day, and you have to put those motions. You have to table them in advance. So sometimes parties will table several of them and then pick from the one they want, depending on if it's opportune or not. So, like the non-confidence motion, the Conservatives have put it. They've tabled it, and they can pick it up at any time, but they're just not going to go forward with it. The Bloc Québécois has tabled 3 motions, one of which is to ask Parliament to put an end to the Teck Frontier oil sands mine in northeast Alberta, and so it's one of 3. It's not guaranteed to go forward, but it was astounding to me. We were tipped off that this happened, and our news editor Dave Naylor broke the story, and it went absolutely viral. The Western Standard's website has had just wildly high readership numbers ever since that story is broken. And absolutely no other major media outlet in the country has picked it up, including the Ottawa Press Gallery, where people are paid full-time to sit around and watch the minutiae of Ottawa. We don't do that. We're Western-based. We don't have anyone sitting directly in Ottawa. We're Western-focused, but obviously much happens there that affects us. And no one else had picked up on this. We broke it. And then, much to my surprise, no one else has picked it up since. This is a big deal. It's not guaranteed that this motion will actually come for debate, because the Bloc's next opposition day, when they would have the chance to put this motion forward, is after the deadline for the federal cabinet to make a decision around Teck. I suspect that if they approve it, that motion might not go forward. Or I think the only way this motion goes forward, though, is if decision around Teck is delayed. And there's a very strong chance of that. And delay could mean an actual delay, or more likely, delay actually just means it's been put into regulatory limbo and will be, it's just sending Teck a message that they should walk away from the whole thing. Ottawa wants to kill it, but doesn't want to explicitly do so and trigger the wrath of Westerners. But either way, this is wild that it's coming from the Bloc Québécois, the great defender of provincial rights, the party that is dedicated to keeping Ottawa out of their business, is putting forward a motion to have Ottawa reach across a continent and kill a project that doesn't even involve any other province. So there's the consistency of politicians for you.
Well, they do draw a lot of their support from the left. And, the left in the world doesn't like oil or oil sands, especially.
Well, the Bloc Québécois, remember, was founded primarily as the voice for Quebec, not necessarily a left-wing thing.
Mm-hmm.
Being Quebec, it always tilted to the left, but its autonomist or independence agenda always was supposed to trump its ideological agenda. The ideological agenda was there, but it was always secondary to Quebec issues.
Yeah.
In this case, they're not necessarily that concerned with being consistent about keeping Ottawa out of their business. They're very happy to have Ottawa expand its powers and intrude into other provinces' business, showing that, and this has been the case for a very long time, especially post-Lucien Bouchard, where the Bloc has been more concerned actually with ideological issues than in protecting the jurisdiction of the provinces.
And for anyone who studies history, Lucien Bouchard was first elected as a progressive conservative, if I recall correctly, and broke away from that party. So, there's, and then the Bloc was formed. All right. Any other thoughts on that one, Deirdre?
It's an interesting issue, as Derek said, because provincially it is a provincial / federal matter. But do we even want to get into the fact that the Alberta government right now is going to file an appeal so that they don't have to make a decision on a proposed oil sands project?
Deirdre, why don't you give some more background on that? That's very interesting, and it's really kind of flown below the radar because it doesn't have the aspect of outrage from Ottawa. I mean, Alberta's probably got more right to make these decisions than Ottawa, but it is Alberta making Alberta's government making an interesting decision here. Why don't you give us some background?
So I have tried to actually put this into a headline at least twice, but it's very difficult to explain in a summary and something even pithy that the Alberta government is holding up approval on an oil sands project. So this has been going on for over a year and a half. It did apparently start under the NDP government. However, it has gone on with, so it's Prosper Petroleum Limited. They have a project, it's called the Rigel Project, RIGEL, and they would like to have an answer. Actually, it's not even necessarily that at this point they're even begging for it to be approved. They want an answer, one way or the other. They just want an answer. So they just won a court order. A judge said that the Alberta government has to make a decision within 10 days. And so this sort of popped up in that, right? That Prosper had won this judge's order to get a decision on their project within 10 days. And then it comes out almost like not even a couple hours later that the Alberta government is going to appeal that. Like, it's so conflicting. And like I said, I can't fit it into a headline because someone would read it and think, oh, the Alberta government is trying to get this approved. No, that's not the case. The Alberta government is holding this up. I mean, at the same time as they're grandstanding about the federal government approving Teck. So I'm really confused about this. I will hopefully hear back from the Ministry of Energy today. I did receive an email saying that the press secretary there would give me a call later today. And so I'm patiently awaiting that because this is just beyond.
Well, I think it is very hypocritical of the provincial government to be going at Ottawa for holding up approval of the Teck mine while they're simultaneously doing this. That being said, a major project awaiting regulatory and political approval. If it has to be made by a government, it should be made by the government closest to the people. That should be the provincial government making the decision.
Which again makes this worse because they're the ones holding this up.
Well, they're holding up a different project, but yes, very, very fair. So that's a fair point. It's wildly hypocritical, but it's a whole other argument to say, why should Ottawa have any say in this whatsoever? For me, actually, my issue isn't even really that Ottawa's holding it up. It's that why does Ottawa have any say over it to begin with? They shouldn't even be allowed to say yes. They shouldn't have anything to say about it whatsoever. It takes place within Alberta. It doesn't cross a provincial boundary. There should be no federal issue here whatsoever, period.
Well, as a British Columbian, I'm very interested to hear what Alberta's Canadian Energy Centre has to say.
You know what? That's not on the agenda.
There's another can of worms there, Paul.
I think we need to talk. We haven't really got into that here. It's not on the agenda. I'm pulling rank as publisher and putting it on the agenda. Let's talk about the Canadian Energy Centre, otherwise known as the War Room. Who wants to open that can of worms?
I'll pass.
Okay, I
Deirdre,
will.
Let the hate flow through you.
I will start. So, the $30 million per year propaganda arm of the Alberta government.
No, that's one propaganda arm of the provincial government. There are several, most notably the Public Affairs Bureau, which has been around for about 20 years.
But does it also cost $30 million a year?
Probably
I don't
more.
have the exact budget in front of me, but I think it's actually more. But
is there more than 6 people working there?
There's quite a few people there. I just want to correct the record. This is one of the propaganda arms of the government.
All right. So one of the many propaganda arms of the Alberta government, the Canadian Energy Centre, it's been under fire since it started, right? It stole a logo, which apparently it paid for. Well, it paid another company to steal it for them, essentially. They did change it. They did come under fire again about that logo, but apparently decided that it's not really quite close enough. And so there was the logo issue. There's been, the latest was a Twitter thread that just, it attacked the credibility of the New York Times and just wildly out of its own element here. And it actually did end up, whoever had posted them did end up deleting them. The CEO, Tom Olson, former journalist, did come out and apologize for these tweets. The thing is, this is a very costly, interesting experiment into what government can, I guess, spend their money on. And of course, this is all the more interesting because it's not FOIPable. This has been created as a private corporation.
Please explain what is FOIP to our listeners.
Freedom of Information and Privacy Laws. Yes,
Gotcha.
Sorry.
Beautiful.
I thought this was like some UK slang bad word that she was using. So,
which, almost. So this, the company, the Canadian Energy Centre, is not subject to requests for any information, really. It was set up that way on purpose so that I believe some government representative or Jason Kenney himself at one point said that the reason that they were making it so that no one could request information was because they didn't feel like giving out their strategy would be beneficial to their overall strategy. Their overall strategy appears to be really nothing at all. But they are, they've made themselves a national embarrassment. They've made Alberta Communications a national embarrassment. And the three directors of this private company are the Energy Minister, Sonia Savage, Environment and Parks Minister, Jason Nixon, and the Justice Minister, Doug Schweitzer. And I did actually send a request for comment to all three of those departments, asking if anyone of those directors was going to come forward and say anything. I did not get a response.
This has just been a shit show since the beginning. It's actually been criticized even before it was brought in. It was named War Room, and they've made an aggressive effort to not be known as the War Room, but it's hard to be known as anything but the War Room when the public was told it'll be a war room. Yeah. And it very much has acted in that way. I was pretty skeptical of it from the beginning. I mean, I and I'm sure many of our listeners are as frustrated as anyone about misinformation about Alberta and Canadian energy in the media. The New York Times, I think, is got some credibility issues to be called into question, but not by a government-funded propaganda arm. If you're going to call into question the credibility of a news outlet, you should not be a government news outlet with government bureaucrats who call themselves reporters when they call other media outlets. There's a credibility problem there. And so all you do is strengthen the hand of something like the New York Times, which, I think many of our listeners would not find particularly worth the money to buy. But they've just made they got this whole thing ass backwards. I mean, if you're conservatives, you generally are supposed to believe, at least theoretically, that governments can't do most things as well as the private sector. The private sector is supposed to be the news business, the information business, not the government. And the government's already got a huge budget for communications within every single minister's office, within every department, within the premier's office, within the public affairs bureau. So when I say that this is one of many propaganda arms, I really do mean it. Not that we would take the government money, but this thing's getting $30 million. If the Western Standard had 1/20th of that budget, just imagine the chaos we could create with these green hippies. We could savage them mercilessly, and we would have way more fun, and we'd be way better at it than some government propaganda arm. And there's actually some pretty smart people working there, but they're out of their element, because some of the really smart people who are working there, some of which I know, they're now doing government communications in an area that's not supposed to be government communications. This is supposed to be advocacy groups like CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the Canadian Oil Drillers Association, Canada Action, and many sympathetic media outlets like the Western Standard. We do this stuff a lot better than government possibly can. And so I think this has finally reached a breaking point. I'm seeing a lot of right-leaning conservatives, including some people who are dangerously close to being Kool-Aid drinkers within the UCP, who have now said, this has failed, we got to stop it. The problem is that this government doesn't exactly like to admit when it's wrong. Politicians in general don't. I can tell you it's not a good idea to admit when you're wrong in politics, but they are wrong, and they've got to be trying to find a way out of this. And so either they're going to sacrifice an individual like Tom Olson, who heads it, or the entire operation itself. Or alternatively, and I think most likely, they say they can get away with anything and just tell it to keep a low profile for the next 3 years.
For those of you who are watching this video, see our related video called Fildebrandt Owns the Green Hippies. All right.
That's rated R.
That's I tried that fell. Maybe somebody laughed. Like this video if you laughed at that joke. All right. So
we're laughing on the inside for you, Paul.
Okay, good. Whew. Man, don't quit your day job. All right. And you're right. I would just say quickly, when I first heard about this, I thought, oh, that's great. It's good that Canada has a center that's going to, tell the other side of the story and not just be a propaganda or maybe be an education thing. And it obviously has been disappointing all around. Not much more to say on that. Finally, the Edmonton Eskimos, Canada's most politically incorrect football team, decided to keep their name. I guess they reached out to some Inuit communities, polled some people, had some conversations, and determined that this is okay. Any thoughts on that, guys?
It turns out the only people who were offended were white urban liberals. There are actually people called Eskimos. It's not a derogatory term. There are some sports teams like the Redskins where it's like, it wasn't meant to be racist or offensive. You don't name a team something that is bad. That's why they're Titans, they're Vikings. We don't hear our Norwegian Canadians complaining about the Vikings. And
right.
That term's got some negative connotations. But it's not like the Redskins here or something where it's genuinely offensive. There are Inuit communities known as Eskimos. They don't take offense to this. And so it turned out that, the only people who were bleeding on about this weren't any actual Inuit peoples or Eskimos. It was people in downtown Edmonton and Toronto who thought it was offensive to their white liberal sensibilities.
Deirdre, what are your thoughts?
Well, I do believe that the comedian Jim Jeffries did a fantastic exploration of this. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend that you do. He came to Edmonton. He went up to the Northwest Territories. He had some conversations. He was essentially disappointed that there wasn't more controversy actually there, because a lot of Eskimos fans did say, if this turned out to be something that was really hurtful to a community, if we have to change the name, we have to change the name. I believe at that point, Jeffrey said that seems like the most Canadian end to a controversy possible. It was so well done. And the thing is, I think, I honestly love the fact that they did reach out to communities and say, hey, we've never really asked your opinion before. Is this a problem? Like that's in so many cases, sometimes that's all that people are looking for is just, hey, ask us. And actually during Jeffrey's visit as well, when he was talking with a couple of women from the Northwest Territories, and I don't remember exactly where it was, which is unfortunate, but they said, no, we're not offended. We felt like this was our team because it was called the Eskimos. And so that was kind of like, that was kind of cool. It was a, it was a real answer to